Hi, and thank you for joining me for this discussion of managing admin rights in the enterprise. Now, before we get started, there's two things I'd like to mention. The first is that all the slides, speakers' notes, and the demos are available for download, and I'll be providing a link at the end of the talk. I tend to be one of those folks who can't keep up with the speaker and take notes at the same time. So for those folks in the same situation, there is no need to take notes. Everything I'm covering is going to be available for download. The second is to please hold all questions until the end. If you've got questions, make a note of them and then ask me afterwards in the Q&A. With luck, I'll be able to answer most of your questions during the talk itself. So we're here to talk about admin rights. As part of approaching this, let's first look at Apple's existing platforms and how the concept of admin user rights applies to each. So Apple currently has 4 platforms, 5 if you count iPadOS as being a separate platform from iOS. So we have iOS, iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, and watchOS. So most of these platforms do not have the concept of multiple users. There's just one user state in play by default. So iOS and iPadOS do include authentication, but there is still usually only one user context which is in scope. So iPadOS does have the concept of multiple user accounts by supporting user sessions for multiple managed Apple IDs, but that's a special configuration option for when sharing an iPad between multiple people is necessary. So all the managed Apple ID user accounts are equal in terms of what they can do on the iPad. So the idea of standard user versus admin user doesn't really come into play. Instead, the user paradigm is equal user rights with separation of documents and data for each user. So when we're discussing the paradigm of multiple user accounts and those accounts having different permissions for access and actions, we're really only talking about one Apple platform, and that is Macs running macOS. Now, the Macs haven't always had this, though. If you look at the various versions of the original macOS between System 1's introduction and macOS 9, you see a similar user paradigm to what you see on Apple's other platforms. By default, there was only one user context, and the operating system would boot into it automatically. So if the paradigm we use today didn't come from the original macOS, where did it come from? Well, it comes from Next computers, and more specifically, the Unix-based NextStep operating system developed by Next. And Apple bought Next in 1996. By 1998, Apple is using NextStep's foundations to build what would eventually become macOS 10. Now, this included building a Unix-based operating system, which included multiple user accounts. And more importantly for our discussion today, NextStep included the paradigm of an account named root, which is a super user account. So on NextStep, root can do anything. It has read-write access to the entire local file system, and it can run any command. So Apple had previously built Unix-based operating systems with super user accounts for specialized purposes, but now Apple is mainstreaming the paradigm for its main operating system of both multiple user accounts and a super user account, which has both more access and privileges than other user accounts. However, there's only one root user in Unix and only one password to that account. Sharing passwords is a security issue. Apple's solution was to introduce a new set of super user privileges for macOS 10, which they designated an admin account. And these privileges could then be applied to multiple accounts. So management of which accounts have admin rights is handled by membership in a group called admin. However, membership in this group only handles admin rights for the macOS 10 graphical user interface. To provide administrative rights on the command line, Apple uses the sudo command line tool, and this tool enables authorized user accounts to run commands as root or as another user. So as part of the OS installation process, Apple installs a configuration file for sudo that grants members of the admin group all the privileges that the sudo tool can grant. Now, in turn, this means that members of the admin group have the same ability as the root account to run all commands and functions with the root account's privileges. So with regards to the actual root user, Apple put some controls in place to limit the actual root user account. These controls include disabling the root account by default, discouraging its use, and providing ways to access elevated or root privileges using other means. So this same model has been used in all versions of the operating system since Cheetah through Monterey. And as mentioned, you're basically just taking a look at in Monterey, you still have the administrators group and you put your users into it. And for, again, in Monterey, you're still using the sudoers configuration file to provide access to the admin group for all the privileges a sudo can grant. So now there are non-root user accounts which have more privileges than other user accounts. So what's the difference in privileges between admin and standard? Well, admin users can add or remove user accounts, they can install applications, and they can change their account settings and also system settings. Standard users can change settings which affect their own account and also install software. Now, I could see some folks looking at the last item in the standard user list and saying, wait, standard users can't install software. They need admin for that, right? Well, not really. For some apps, self-contained ones, like for example, Firefox, you could do something like this, where you set up a applications folder inside your own account's home folder, and then copy Firefox into that. And then once it's finished copying over, you can go ahead and launch it. So admin rights weren't needed for any step of that. But Firefox runs all the same and is fully functional. So that's a software installation. Now, it's also possible to install software as a standard user using the App Store. Now, this does not mean that all installation is allowed. Installing applications via an installer package will request authentication from a user account with admin privileges. And without that, installation will fail. So from a user experience perspective, that request for authentication is the main delineation between what standard user accounts can do and what admin user accounts can do. A standard user's authentication won't be accepted, but an admin user's authentication will be accepted and the desired action performed. So the same user experience also applies to changing settings. So when you're changing settings which only apply to the logged in user, no authentication is requested. But when you're changing settings which apply to the system as a whole, authentication by an admin user is required. So now we know the backstory on the different kinds of user accounts on Apple's Mac operating system. So why does it matter whether someone has admin rights or not? This is why it matters. Anything the root account, an admin account can also do. So giving admin rights to a user account on the current version of macOS means that they now have all the powers that root has. So as discussed earlier, on most Unix-based operating systems, the root account can do absolutely anything. It has read-write access to the entire local file system, and it can run any command. So from a security perspective, this seems like an easy case. Unless you're willing to trust your users with the ability to do absolutely anything on their Macs, you shouldn't give them admin rights, right? Well, let's take a deeper look at that. How well does that statement apply to the current version of macOS? Apple has implemented a number of security features, which, among other things, limit the power of root and admin users. The most recent change is the moving of macOS's system software to a read-only isolated boot volume as of macOS Catalina. And this boot volume is cryptographically sealed as of macOS Big Sur. And if the seal is tampered with, macOS won't boot, and it must be reinstalled. And to limit what the super user can do and add another layer to macOS's security model, Apple has developed System Integrity Protection, or SIP. SIP is designed to limit the power of root and protect the system even from its own superuser. So as part of the security model, the macOS kernel has SIP-related functionality built in to prevent processes from writing to certain protected parts of the file system. And this protection is in addition to that read-only boot volume. SIP's configuration is stored in NVRAM, so the current configuration will apply even when boot drives are switched and also if the OS is reinstalled. Now, SIP is an overall security policy with the goal of preventing system files and processes from being modified by third parties. Now, to achieve this, it has the following concepts. It has file system protection, runtime protection, and kernel extension protection. Now, Apple has set a number of directories used by macOS as being protected by SIP. Now, with some exceptions, which I'll be talking more about in a bit, all files and folders contained within these directories cannot be moved, edited, or changed by root or any other user on the system. And Apple has also set a number of directories used by macOS as being available to developers. So in one of those exceptions I was just talking about, /user is protected by SIP, but /user local is not. That means that developers are explicitly permitted to place files and folders within user local without worrying that Apple's going to lock down that directory. Now, SIP's protections are not limited to protecting the system from file system changes. There are also system calls that are now restricted in their functionality. For example, dtrace can inspect system processes, either by using the instruments application or the dtrace command line tool. Now, however, SIP does not block inspection by the developer of their own application while they're being developed. Xcode's tools will continue to allow apps to be inspected and debugged during the development process. Now, for more information on this, I recommend taking a look at Apple's developer documentation for SIP, which is available via the link on the screen. Now, even though kernel extensions are on their way out, SIP will also block the installation of unsigned kernel extensions. In order to install a kernel extension with SIP enabled, the kernel extension must be signed with the developer ID for signing kex certificate and be installed into library extensions. It also needs to be compiled for the processor that you are trying to run the kernel extension on. So for example, if you're trying to run an Intel compiled kernel extension on Apple Silicon Macs, it won't run. So more information on this is also available in Apple's developer documentation for SIP. And for those interested, the kernel extension documentation is available via the link shown on the screen. Now, SIP has a configuration file which is stored in System Library Sandbox and is named rootless.conf. It lists all the applications and top-level directories which SIP is protecting. So this protection applies to the writable parts of the Mac's disk. So in addition to the read-only boot volume, this is marking even more of the Mac's file system off limits to being altered by the root user. Now, Apple has defined some exceptions to SIP's protection in the rootless.conf file, and those exceptions are marked in the rootless file with asterisks. So these mark writable files and directories which are stored in otherwise protected locations. Apple has also put in place protections for user data, where permission to access the data must be granted by either the user in question or by a profile delivered by a mobile device management server which the Mac is enrolled with. These permissions are also not granted to a user account, but they're instead granted to the process actually requesting access to the user data in question. So after examining all the protections Apple has put in place to contain the power of the root account, where large sections of the file system can't be written to or altered, and user data requires permission to access, let's re-examine the statement about root as it relates to administrator rights. It remains true that anything root can do, and account with admin rights can do, but what root can do on macOS is significantly contained compared to other Unix-based OSs. And with that lowered capability also comes lowered risk. So now that we've examined how admin rights and their capabilities, admin rights work and their capabilities, let's look at managing them. As discussed earlier, Apple has enabled an account to have admin rights in two locations. The first place is by adding the user account in question to the admin group. Adding to the admin group gives the account the ability to authenticate for admin rights in the macOS graphical user interface. However, this does not apply to the command line interface. For the command line, as discussed earlier, Apple installs a configuration file for sudo, which grants members of the admin group all the privileges that the sudo tool can grant. So what's this mean? Well, admin rights for the GUI and for the command line can actually be managed separately. If desired, you could assign admin rights in the GUI, but not to the command line, or vice versa, by editing the sudo configuration file to change it from Apple's default settings. Properly editing the sudo configuration is an advanced topic which we won't be covering today in this talk, but this is an aspect of admin rights management to be aware of. Now, assuming that you choose to manage admin rights, there's three states of management to consider for your accounts. There's admin rights all the time, there's no admin rights ever, and allowing admin rights at least some of the time. So there's pros and cons to each idea, so let's consider each in turn. The first is granting admin rights to your users without time limits or other restrictions. Now, this is relatively straightforward, as by default, all you should need to do is add the account in question to the admin group. The pro is that account can perform all the actions that any admin user on the Mac can perform. The main con is going to be the same. That account can perform all actions that any admin user on that Mac can perform. The second is granting no admin rights to your users. Again, this is relatively straightforward, as by default, you shouldn't need to do anything besides create the account and not specify admin rights for it. Now, the pro is that standard accounts are limited in the actions that they can take. Now, this is also the con, because every necessary action that a user may need to take, they may not have the ability to perform it. So for you as the IT admin, this may mean that you'll need to come up with a mechanism which enables users with only standard user rights the ability to perform an action which only root or an administrator can perform. So the last state is the in-between, where admin rights are granted at least some of the time to an account, and those same rights are taken away at least some of the time. So is there one answer? Is there one best way? Unfortunately, there is not. What works for one shop may not work for another. So there are a number of factors which affect this discussion, which may include legal requirements, complying with the requirements of an external standard that your business has committed to complying with, internally created policy requirements of your company, school, or institution, or even operational requirements in your environment. No matter what, though, the key question which must be answered is going to be if you can trust your users with admin rights. If you can, in my opinion, then they should have them. If you can't, then they shouldn't. So since different situations are going to have different answers, what's the answer for my environment? Well, my own shop is using the in-between model of non-permanent admin rights. So to manage and enforce this, we're using a tool called Privileges, which we built and open sourced. And for those interested, it's available via the link on the screen. And as a matter of fact, we released a new version of Privileges yesterday, version 153. So where did this tool come from and why did SAP start using it? Well, in 2009, both my current boss, Harold Monahart, and my teammate, Mark Thielman, worked for a German publishing house. And this publishing house decided to switch some of their departments from using Windows PCs to now using Macs. So the goal behind the switch was to move users towards a self-service model where the users could handle more support issues themselves without needing the help desk. So the admin rights management aspect of the plan was that all Macs would have admin rights to help facilitate the users being able to help themselves more. However, not all the folks moving to Macs were comfortable with having admin rights. They were afraid they would break something if they had admin rights. So as part of that, two tools were created using Apple Script Studio. The first enabled logged in users to add themselves to the admin group, and the second would remove the logged in user from the admin group. So over time, the tool was refined where it moved from two tools written in Apple Script Studio to one tool written in Objective-C, which handled both adding and removing the logged in user from the admin group. In 2016, both Harold and Mark were hired by SAP. So at the time, admin rights at SAP were being handled such that the first account on the device was a generic admin user for use by the IT department. SAP was also using AD mobile accounts on Macs at the time, and the mobile account of the Macs assigned user was also added to the admin group. So this was done by having a script on the Mac check with a separate system to see if the mobile account in question belonged to the machine's owner, as defined in this separate system. Now, the problem was that the script had a high failure rate. So many times the help desk would have to intervene and manually do the admin rights assignment. Now, at the same time, SAP's IT security ran penetration testing on their managed endpoints as part of their work to secure the SAP computing environment. And one of the recommendations which came out of the testing was that while the business need for admin rights was recognized, people should not work with permanently assigned admin rights. So at this point, the decision was made to write our privileges tool. Harold and Mark knew that a self-service model worked, as at one point they had 6,000 users using the previous tools for adding and removing admin rights. Privileges also solved three issues at once for SAP. The first was that it removed the need to centrally assign an owner to a device. Second, it allowed people to get admin rights on demand. And the third thing was that Privileges includes a command line tool, and I'll be discussing that in more detail later. And this command line tool provides a mechanism to remove admin rights for users without the user's involvement. So between these 3 points, we achieved the rare accomplishment of making both security and our users happy. So beginning with macOS Sierra in 2016, SAP has included Privileges as part of its standard setup for all SAP managed Macs. Our answer is to use standard users by default and ensure that the Privileges app is installed. So that means that our users run as standard users the vast majority of the time. But when they need admin rights, those rights are available on demand. So here's how Privileges looks from the user perspective. If you're a standard user and you want admin rights, you would verify that Privileges is installed, and then you would use the following procedure. You would launch Privileges. You would click the Request Privileges button. The Privileges dock icon should change to look like a yellow unlocked padlock, and a message should appear that Privileges have been changed successfully. And the logged in account should now have admin rights. If you are an admin user and you want to remove admin rights, verify that privileges is installed and then use the following procedure. You launch privileges, you click the remove privileges button. The privileges dock icon should change to look like a green locked padlock, and a message should appear that privileges have been changed successfully. The logged in account should now have standard user rights. Now, privileges also includes the concept of time-limited admin, which in privileges is available exclusively via the toggle privileges function. The default amount of time is 20 minutes, though you can change this in the privileges settings. Now, for more information about this, please see the privileges FAQ, which is linked at the bottom of the screen. Now, as previously mentioned, privileges also includes a command line tool, which allows you to use privileges from a script or the command line. So the privileges CLI command line tool currently supports the following options. There's privileges CLI add, which adds the logged in user to the admin group. There's privileges CLI remove, which removes the logged in user from the admin group. And there's privileges CLI status, which shows what privileges the logged in user has. And the privileges CLI command line tool can also be run without any modifier, and that displays the help information. So SAP uses the privileges command line tool for managing privileges by installing a launch agent, which runs the tool's remove option to remove admin rights on login. So this removes the user logging in from the admin group, which automatically puts the user back to standard user rights. For those wanting to implement a similar solution, a sample launch agent is available via the link at the bottom of the screen. So as mentioned previously, we open source privileges, and it's been very interesting and gratifying to our team to see that a number of other folks have been interested in it. We've even seen folks build solutions for their own needs based on privileges. We've also seen vendors use privileges to build extended functionality for their own products. Now, is privileges the right tool for your environment to help you manage admin rights? Well, going back to our earlier discussion about trust, you really do need to answer that fundamental question. If you can trust your users with admin rights, then privileges may be a good tool for helping you manage those rights. If you can't, there is nothing privileges can do to help you with that. So it is really crucial to settle this fundamental issue before you proceed. Now, that said, many times I've heard the discussion coming down to this. However, the understanding of what anything means comes from this era, when it should be coming from this era, when a number of limitations have been placed on both what the root account and the admin accounts can do. This is the logical place to start from when trying to answer the question about trusting your users with admin rights. So I know I've tossed a lot of links at you during this presentation, but these are the most important links you'll see in this presentation because this is how you get it all. PDF with the presenter's notes is available via the first link. And the keynote slides are available from the link on the bottom, which includes the slides, the speakers, the demo notes, the speaker's notes. Everything that I've just been talking about is included with the keynote slides. So thank you for joining me today. And I think we have about 5 minutes left for Q&A.